I'm Penelope, 31 years old, and as I stood behind the marble reception desk, I let them talk. Tracy's shrill voice cut through the soft jazz playing in the background. She called me a glorified maid, loudly complaining about the terrible service, and demanded I fetch her a complimentary champagne flute. She treated me like the lowest servant on the payroll, performing entirely for the benefit of the wealthy onlookers. Tracy snapped her fingers inches from my face. The sharp crack dragged my mind straight back to the nightmare from 3 years ago. They accomplished far more than throwing me out into the snow to make room for Jada. Brian executed a methodical financial slaughter. He forged my signature on a power of attorney. With one stroke of a pen, he drained our $500,000 joint savings account. He secretly mortgaged the home in my name to inject cash into his failing company. Tracy backed his play perfectly, planting vicious rumors among our friends, painting me as an unstable, jealous wife. By the time they locked the doors against me, my reputation was ashes. People always ask why I walked away so quietly that December night. They question my refusal to fight back, my failure to call the police immediately. They fail to understand the invisible chain of a survivor. Years of relentless gaslighting had completely rewired my reality. They conditioned me to believe every argument was my fault, every failure my own doing. I was paralyzed inside a psychological prison without bars, genuinely convinced I was unworthy of a loving family. My silence back then served as raw survival. They mistook my trauma response for permanent defeat. In reality, that freezing isolation became the incubator for the unshakable power I hold today. PDF plus 4. Tracy slammed her handbag onto the counter, snapping me back to the present. Brian crossed his arms, smirking like a king surveying his conquered land. He tapped his luxury watch, reminding me my time to comply was running out. But my attention drifted past his tailored suit. Near the grand piano, a group of prominent Charleston investors watched the commotion with intense interest. The puzzle pieces instantly clicked into place. Brian came here for business, not love. His real estate company was bleeding out, completely bankrupt. The luxury cars, the suits, this massive $300,000 makeup wedding, it was all a desperate illusion. He was using the sheer opulence of this hotel to project false wealth, a trap to scam those exact investors into funding a fake rescue project. Tracy's gaze shifted toward the sweeping marble staircase in the center of the lobby. Her eyes darted to Jada's stiletto heels, carefully measuring the distance. The backup plan was painfully obvious. A swift rejection from me meant Jada would take a calculated tumble down those stairs. A staged slip-and-fall lawsuit designed to extort millions from the hotel. Brian leaned close over the counter, ordering me to process the paperwork immediately. He promised to make my life a living hell upon my refusal. I held his gaze, pulled a heavy brass pen from the holder, and slid a blank event agreement across the polished stone. I pushed the heavy brass pen and a blank event agreement across the polished marble. It was a standard liability waiver. But tucked neatly inside the fine print were mandatory clauses demanding full verification of corporate funding and absolute waivers for any accidental injuries on the premises. Brian snatched the pen immediately. He ignored the text entirely. He just flashed that familiar, arrogant smirk, assuming I was finally surrendering to his demands. He scribbled his name on the bottom line, practically tearing the paper with the force of his signature. He shoved the document toward Jada. She eagerly traced her own name right below his, giggling under her breath. Tracy grabbed the pen last, signing violently as the official guarantor. 3 signatures, 0 hesitation. Tracy's pathetic staircase backup plan evaporated into thin air the second the ink dried. Watching them gloat, a sudden, sharp clarity washed over me. This breathtaking arrogance wasn't strength. It was the illusion of power from an empty wallet. Their entire social and financial status was nothing more than a fragile shell, a temporary identity rented with stolen money. Now that the money was completely gone, they had absolutely no internal value left to stand on. The closer they edged toward total bankruptcy and ruin, the more desperate they became to project absolute superiority. They needed to scream at a hotel manager in front of an audience just to convince themselves they still mattered. Brian tossed the pen onto the counter. It clattered loudly against the stone. "Now," Brian snapped, adjusting his tailored cuffs. "I want the grand ballroom prepped by Friday. And get a bellhop to bring our luggage up to the penthouse. We're staying the week." I picked up the signed contract. I folded it once, perfectly down the center, and slipped it into the inside pocket of my blazer. I met his entitled gaze with dead, unblinking silence. No. The single syllable hung in the air, cold and absolute. Tracy's smug smile instantly warped into a vicious snarl. The veins in her neck bulged against her heavy pearl necklace. The wealthy patrons near the piano stopped talking, their eyes darting toward our escalating confrontation. "Excuse me?" Tracy hissed, her shrill voice echoing off the high crystal ceilings. "You are a glorified receptionist. You do not say no to us. I will have your job for this." She dug furiously into her oversized handbag, her hands shaking with rage. Her diamond-encrusted fingers pulled out a sleek smartphone. She aggressively tapped the screen, locking her eyes on mine with pure malice. "I found the direct executive line for the hotel's ownership group online," Tracy boasted, holding the phone up like a loaded weapon. "You're done, Penelope. By the time I hang up, you'll be back on the streets where you belong." She pressed the call button. She slammed her thumb against the speaker icon so every VIP in the lobby can hear my professional execution. The line rang once. A split second later, a sharp, distinctive ringtone pierced the heavy silence of the lobby. The ringing wasn't coming from the speaker. It was coming directly from my blazer. Tracy's eyes darted downward. Brian's arrogant smirk froze entirely. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped the green accept button. I held the device up, bringing it just inches away from Tracy's pale, trembling face. "Charleston Grand Boutique, majority shareholder speaking," I said. My voice echoed simultaneously from my own device, and the speakerphone clutched in Tracy's hand. Tracy's jaw dropped. All the blood drained from her cheeks in an instant, leaving her face a sickly, chalky white. "I don't work for the owner, Tracy," I whispered, leaning slowly over the marble counter. "I bought the building." The phone slipped from Tracy's trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp crack, the screen splintering into a spiderweb of glass. Brian physically stumbled backward, his carefully practiced posture collapsing entirely. The prominent Charleston investors standing near the piano stopped their quiet chatter, turning fully toward us. The air in the lobby grew so thin I could hear Brian's erratic breathing. I refused to give them a single second to recover. I snapped my fingers. Two of my head security guards stepped out from the corridor, flanking Tracy and Brian immediately. I gestured toward the investors, warmly inviting them to join a special presentation regarding Brian's real estate portfolio. We moved into the main executive boardroom. I stood at the head of the long mahogany table. Tracy sank into a leather chair, clutching her designer bag against her chest like a shield. Brian stood frozen near the door, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. I pressed a button on my remote. The massive wall screen flared to life. It omitted the glorious architectural renderings Brian promised his investors. Instead, it displayed the forged power of attorneys side by side with his fraudulent bank transfers. The numbers blared in high definition: $500,000, the exact amount he stole to fund his fake empire. Then, I played the audio recording. Tracy's shrill voice echoed through the boardroom, explicitly plotting Jada's fake staircase injury to extort my hotel. The investors began whispering furiously, pulling out their phones to cancel their pending wire transfers. Brian's face turned the color of wet ash. Sweat beaded on his forehead, rolling down his temple and staining his expensive collar. He stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the screen, desperately shouting about a corporate misunderstanding. I cut him off. I leaned against the table, steepling my fingers. I explained that my private equity firm spent the last 3 months quietly buying up his defaulted corporate debt from his primary lenders. I owned his loans. I was officially his largest secured creditor, and my attorneys were legally initiating immediate asset seizure protocols on his remaining properties. Panic consumed him. Brian whipped his head toward Jada. He grabbed her arm, his voice cracking as he ordered her to tell the investors the documents were fabricated. He begged her to play the devoted fiancé. Jada ripped her arm out of his grip. She locked eyes with him, her expression completely void of fear. She walked straight across the boardroom and stood firmly by my side. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a silver USB drive, and dropped it onto the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. Jada turned to the horrified investors. She revealed Brian's glorious wedding was a trap. He planned to force her into signing an ironclad prenuptial agreement tomorrow morning, legally transferring all his toxic corporate debt into her name so he could flee the country with their investment capital. Jada had called me 3 weeks ago. We cut a deal for her complete legal immunity in exchange for the shell company records. Brian stared at us, his jaw unhinged, trapped in total silence. The very woman he used to replace me had just hammered the final nail into his absolute destruction. 2 local police officers walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom. The steel handcuffs clicked shut. Brian's breath hitched in his throat, a sharp, ragged gasp tearing through the dead silence. A thick layer of sweat coated his pale forehead, dripping down the bridge of his nose and soaking the collar of his expensive custom shirt. His pupils dilated in absolute terror. His eyes darted wildly, searching the faces of the wealthy Charleston investors for a single lifeline. They just stared back, their expressions twisting into pure, unadulterated disgust. Beside him, Tracy's manicured hands trembled so violently they blurred. The heavy silver bracelets clamped around her wrists dragged her frail arms down, pulling her shoulders into a pathetic slump. Her mouth hung open, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. The officers grabbed their biceps and marched them straight through the grand lobby. They paraded past the crystal chandeliers, past the grand piano, and right past the exact spot where they had demanded a $300,000 wedding just an hour prior. The affluent crowd parted for them, whispering harshly. Tracy and Brian were entirely stripped of their fake royalty, paraded out as common criminals. 4 hours later, my cell phone buzzed against the glass desk. My hospitality director forwarded an urgent alert. Thousands of one-star reviews were flooding our hotel's online directory. Vicious, fabricated paragraphs accused me of physically assaulting pregnant women and embezzling client funds. The notifications flashed across my screen like rapid-fire bullets. Tracy had pre-scheduled an automated bot farm attack. She thought she was dropping a massive digital bomb to ruin my reputation from inside a holding cell. She assumed the sudden public outrage would force me to drop the charges to save my brand. I smiled, sliding my laptop closer. I opened the investigation dashboard my cybersecurity team set up last week. 1 click. The screen instantly populated with the financial origin of the bot farm payments. The digital routing numbers connected directly back to the exact offshore shell accounts Tracy used to hide my stolen $500,000. Her desperate, vindictive attempt to destroy my business handed federal prosecutors the final, undeniable proof of organized wire fraud. The trap snapped shut. I forwarded the dashboard link straight to the assigned federal investigator. By the next morning, the tech platforms flagged the coordinated attack and wiped every single fake review from the internet. The smear campaign completely backfired. The state prosecutor immediately upgraded their charges to federal offenses. The judge took one look at the evidence of ongoing witness intimidation and denied bail for both of them. Tracy and Brian traded their tailored suits and counterfeit designer handbags for standard-issue orange jumpsuits. They faced decades in federal prison, permanently locked inside a concrete cage of their own making. Jada signed her formal immunity deal and walked away into the city, leaving them to rot. I stepped out onto the private balcony of my penthouse suite. The crisp Charleston wind brushed against my face. The deep orange sunset stretched across the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the historic rooftops. 3 years ago, I shivered on a frozen concrete sidewalk, terrified, penniless, and utterly broken. Today, I stand above the city, completely untouchable. They tried to bury me in the snow. They forgot I possessed the fire to melt the entire winter. The gavel cracked against the heavy oak block, sounding like a gunshot in the silent federal courtroom. The judge handed down the final sentence without a single shred of mercy. For the charges of wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit extortion, Brian and Tracy were each sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary, with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The court also ordered mandatory financial restitution of exactly $500,000, effectively authorizing the government to seize every remaining asset tied to Brian's collapsing real estate shell companies. The social fallout in Charleston was absolute and merciless. The elite circles they had sacrificed my sanity to impress turned their backs instantly. Their names were quietly scrubbed from the country club registry. Their opulent home foreclosure was broadcast on the local evening news. The affluent patrons they had tried to dazzle in my hotel lobby now whispered their names like a cautionary tale. The grand illusion of royalty they had violently guarded evaporated into thin air, leaving them with nothing but the devastating reality of their crimes. Jada finalized her immunity deal with the state prosecutors. She packed a single suitcase, left the city boundaries, and vanished completely. The toxic empire was systematically dismantled. 6 months passed. The frantic chaos of the trial settled into a quiet, steady rhythm. Then, a thin paper envelope arrived at the hotel reception desk. The return address was stamped by a federal correctional facility in upstate South Carolina. I recognized Tracy's jagged, frantic handwriting immediately. She had filled 3 pages of cheap, lined paper with a sickeningly sweet narrative. She talked about the sacred bond of family. She claimed she had only ever wanted the best for our future. She begged for a second chance, pleading with me to visit her on the weekends so we could heal our broken ties and move forward as a family unit. Years ago, a letter like that would have triggered a suffocating spiral of guilt. I would have agonized over my supposed duty as a daughter-in-law. This time, my pulse maintained a perfectly calm rhythm. My hands remained entirely steady. I walked over to the administrative office, fed the 3 pages directly into the industrial shredder, and watched the paper turn into meaningless confetti. I took a slow sip of my morning coffee. The silence left behind by the whirring blades wasn't heavy. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. I owed her absolutely nothing. My life today looks nothing like the freezing, isolated existence they tried to force upon me. I built a sanctuary, not just for my international guests, but for myself. The boutique hotel is thriving beyond my wildest projections. But my actual wealth sits around my dinner table on Friday nights. I am surrounded by a fiercely loyal chosen family, my brilliant hospitality team, the early investors who recognized my grit when I had nothing, and friends who respect my boundaries without question. We share meals where no one is fighting for emotional scraps. We eat amidst the clinking of crystal glasses, the warmth of great food, and the sound of genuine, unfiltered laughter. No one manipulates the conversation to tear another person down. We celebrate victories without a trace of jealousy. This profound warmth is the ultimate proof that surviving a toxic environment does not leave you permanently broken. It simply burns away the counterfeit relationships, leaving only the people who choose you for exactly who you are. If you are watching this, and you are currently trapped in the suffocating grip of narcissistic abuse, I need you to listen to me very carefully. People like Brian and Tracy do not return to the scene of the crime because they possess strength or genuine remorse. They return because their fragile, hollow illusions require a victim to sustain them. A narcissist's greatest fear is irrelevance. They mistook my previous silence for weakness, completely failing to understand that surviving absolute betrayal builds a titanium armor that sheer entitlement can never pierce. When you finally walk away from toxic family dynamics, society will often try to hand you a heavy, unbearable burden of guilt. They will quote old proverbs and tell you that blood is thicker than water. Let me give you the 3 rules that actually govern reality. Rule number 1. Blood and shared history are never an excuse for systemic emotional abuse. Loyalty is a premium currency earned through consistent mutual respect, not a mandatory tax demanded through manipulation. Releasing the obligation of a toxic bloodline is not a selfish sin. It is a profound, necessary act of self-preservation. You are entirely allowed to grieve the family you deserved while permanently cutting off the family that actively destroyed you. You do not owe your bright future to the people who tried to bury you in the freezing dark of your past. Rule number 2. The best revenge is never found in screaming matches or retaliatory anger. Fighting back on their terms only feeds their desperate, pathetic need for attention. True, devastating revenge is absolute, untouchable elevation. You defeat a toxic abuser by outgrowing them so completely that their attacks can no longer reach your altitude. When you construct a life grounded in truth and unshakable financial independence, their pathetic lies simply bounce off the solid brick of your reality. Rule number 3. Never accept the false guilt of the survivor. Walking away empty-handed to protect your peace might feel like a catastrophic, terrifying loss in the moment. I walked out into the freezing December snow with nothing but the canvas shoes on my feet. But choosing your personal dignity over their comfortable lies is the most expensive, and ultimately the most valuable investment you will ever make in your own life. The cost of dignity is undeniably high, but the price of staying is your soul. Have you ever had to walk away from everything just to save yourself? And when they finally realized your absolute worth, how did you permanently shut the door in their face? Take a moment to leave your story in the comments below. We are building a powerful community of survivors, and your voice might be the exact lifeline someone else desperately needs to hear today. Please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of justice, resilience, and reclaiming your power. I am Penelope, and I am finally free.